Hello, you're very welcome to If I Were the Minister for Education from anshaw.net. This is Simon Lewis speaking, and I'm delighted to have you with me for this kind of experimental version of the show, because I've decided that I'm going to try and do a little bit of YouTubing as well as the podcast. So hopefully you'll, as well as being able to listen to me on your favourite podcasting platform, whether that's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any of the others, you'll also be able to watch me on YouTube. My hope really is that this will make sense on both platforms, and what I'm trying to do on this is maybe go through a little bit of the news that's been happening over the last couple of weeks in education, particularly in primary education, though I will delve into other areas. And I'm going to do that through showing a sort of a presentation in a way of what made me think over the last couple of weeks. And as I said, hopefully if you don't have a screen in front of you, it'll all make sense. I've picked 5 or 6 different stories that piqued my interest in the news over the last couple of weeks, and they are all available on my newsletter, which you can subscribe to by going to anshaw.net/subscribe. I've done a little bit of media over the last couple of weeks, and one of the things that I wanted to start off with was to tell you all about my chat with Claire Byrne. I really enjoyed chatting to Claire Byrne on the radio, because over in the UK, the government of Wales have decided to consult with everybody and anybody who will listen about whether they should reduce their summer holidays for schools. Now, the second part of that is that they want to take a week off the summer holidays and move it to October, where you get 2 weeks in October rather than 1 week in October. And instead of 5 weeks or 6 weeks in the summer, you get 4 or 5 weeks. And Mary McCarthy, a journalist, thought this was a very good idea, and I was asked to be her counterbalance on the show. So should schools' summer holidays be shortened was the title, but as Mary McCarthy was saying, it was very similar to Wales. Shouldn't we follow what Wales were at and consult with people about the idea of shortening the summer holidays but extending maybe some of the breaks that are on during the year, so midterm breaks maybe extended by a week. And I have to say, I don't think it's a very bad idea. I'm not sure what you think. I think 8 weeks of the summer holidays, I know most of us don't get those 8 weeks. I know for sure I don't. I get about 2.5 of those weeks, because we run the July provision and we have the camps for numeracy and literacy and the complex needs and all that kind of stuff, like many schools do. But if they were to be sort of curtailed a little bit, or curtailed completely, would there be an option really to go for maybe a 6-week summer holiday and maybe take 2 weeks in October and maybe 2 weeks in May to kind of, I suppose, balance the year out? You know, maybe working 6 weeks, then 2 weeks off, 6 weeks, then 2 weeks off. Nobody, I think, which was nice about this podcast, nobody was actually disputing that teachers don't work hard enough. In fact, it was a very nice interview. I had a laugh. I've had a massive ambition since I've ever gone on the radio a few years ago. I've always wanted, when somebody says, oh, teachers' days are too short and they've too many holidays, I've always wanted to say to the radio presenter, do you know, you probably know yourself, people only think you work 2 hours a day, and I managed to do that. And that's a life's ambition ticked off. So if you're interested in listening to that particular podcast, you can go to rte.ie and search for Claire Byrne and Should Schools' Summer Holidays Be Shortened. I had a good time on the show and a bit of fun there too. Let's move on to the next story that piqued my interest, and it's all about solar panels and retrofitting schools for solar panels. And what I noticed when I was looking around for education stories, and I find all my education stories on my Feedly feed. I don't know if that's what you call them, and you can have a look at that again by subscribing to my newsletter. I have every story I find interesting, I save into my Feedly feed, and there seem to be a lot of politicians in their local newspapers celebrating the fact that they're installing solar panels in their primary school. And I found it a very interesting story because I just find all these capital projects when, you know, I think the government are paying €50 million to retrofit solar panels in schools, on school buildings. But the thing about this is, and it brings me back to a debate I had a couple of years ago during the National Maternity Hospital, when tens of thousands of people went out onto the streets basically protesting the fact that the National Maternity Hospital, €2 billion it was going to cost, and the building would be gifted back to the Catholic Church, to the Vatican. And people went out on the streets. They were disgusted that it was going to be handed back to the nuns. And when this happened at that time, I remember I was saying, but folks, every single day, every single year, dozens of schools are retrofitted or are built even. Like brand new buildings are built, repair jobs are done and everything else, to the point of, I would imagine, more than 2 billion. And all that work and all those buildings are gifted back to the Vatican, to the Catholic Church. And there isn't a single one of you talking about that at all. Now, it didn't get a massive reaction apart from people calling me stupid, as you can see here from my Twitter feed. Although most people were fairly generous in what they were saying, but there was some people trying to score some points, trying to claim, I'm only saying it because I work for Educate Together, and I always say that everything I say is my own thoughts, and I work for Educate Together, not because and I love working for Educate Together, but not because I want to specifically, but because I have to, because I can't work in a denominational school, because I cannot uphold a religious ethos. But I'm going off the point, or am I? My thinking really is that every single time the Department of Education puts, they're saying €110 million is being used to retrofit schools, that's all gifted back to the Catholic Church. And I see that as a massive problem. And I think the religious aspect of it maybe colours it and maybe complicates it somewhat, because people think that I'm just being anti-Catholic or whatever it is. I'm really not. It could be any private body. People would say, Educate Together get this, or whoever gets it. They actually don't. Educate Together don't own any buildings, school buildings. What I might compare it to is, because there's a lot of people protesting at the moment for various different reasons, but one of the reasons is outside of the racist element of the protesting that's going outside buildings, is the fact that a lot of people are very unhappy that private people are benefiting from their hotels or their former nursing homes or their former disused buildings. They're very upset because there are rich people who are buying up these unused properties and renting them out and leasing them out to the government for asylum seekers, and they are making a huge amount of money. And people are rightly, I suppose, disgusted by the fact that there is private individuals making millions from taking advantage of Ireland's asylum seeker plans and the accommodation shortage that exists. And you are seeing people taking to the streets for that. Now, I know a lot of them are doing it for different reasons, and they're being riled up by, let's say, less than generous people. But some people who are protesting do find this very, very unappealing, and you can see why. It's public money being given to private individuals. The schools are no different. The private individuals happen to be the Catholic Church, and it was the same when they actually were out in the streets because of the Catholic Church. I think people have a very complicated relationship with nuns or something like that for some reason. The fact that National Maternity Hospital was being granted to the nuns, it seems to be, don't give it to the nuns. But when you actually say, these are being given to the Catholic Church, it seems that people react differently. There hasn't been a murmur of protest. In fact, as I said, politicians are the ones celebrating these things. And thank you very much to Norma Foley for granting us all this money for retrofitting these buildings, despite the fact that the buildings aren't belonging to the state at all. Anyway, I don't know what's going on, because I don't know if the editor of the Irish Times' child goes to a private school, but the Irish Times are having a right go at private schools lately, and I'm not. I joke here. I would be against the idea of private schools, and the nonsensical argument is, it provides choice. That word choice, you see, it doesn't suit you sometimes. Like people say, choice is very important. Choice is very good now when it comes to religious schools and all the rest of it. But when it comes to the private schools where you might lose out because you don't have the same wealth as a lot of people, the word choice there seems to not mean as much. But clearly there's a problem, because private schools were certainly trying to justify themselves and the money that the state gives to provide their teachers. They're saying, if they were given back to state ownership, the Department of Education would have to fund them. And I just found it very funny. There's a kind of a photograph of a particular school, a Cistercian, a private school. And this is, you won't see the picture actually if you're listening to this. If you're watching it, you'll see it here. There's a picture of the principal standing in front of these most eloquent, beautiful thing that you would never see in any public sector school. It is beautiful, colour coded. It's a Christmas. Basically, if you're listening rather than watching, it's the staircase leading up to somewhere, I don't know where, but stained glass windows, beautiful red candles on beautiful silver candelabras. It is a beautiful sight. Something you might see coming into a 5-star hotel. And I reckon you don't have too many public schools being able to decorate their school in that way. I just thought it was kind of funny to see. But the funny thing really, I suppose, is the Irish Times decided that their next article about private schools was that there were higher levels of antisocial behaviour and truancy among students in the fee-charging schools. So those, not only are these rich people, shouldn't be complaining about how wonderful their schools are and about choice. Sure, they're all bowled out, the lot of them. They're all very naughty, and I just thought it was kind of funny that they're more likely to have antisocial behaviour like stealing or graffiti, and the truancy was very higher. And I suppose it was an interesting article about a much bigger study that was out there. I'm not sure what it quite said. It just felt like they were having a go at fee charging schools. But I would have more of a problem with the fee charging schools on a different story, is because the private, maybe this came out, and maybe the Irish Times editor who might have a child in the, I'm only making this stuff up here, I'd have no idea what the editor of the Irish Times or Irish Independent, where they send their children, but maybe they're annoyed because private schools' fees have to rise due to inflation and lack of government funding. So maybe that's why they're having a go at them. So basically the headline there is that they now have to pay over €10,000 for one school. Now, the thing is, the average is what was interesting to me, where they came out and they said the average of all the private schools have gone up by 17% to cover their costs, because the government, basically, while they fund the teachers, they don't cover their costs, their bills, basically, the energy bills, the utility bills and all that, 17%. So what I did was I calculated what increase normal schools are getting in terms of capitation grant. So it's moving up from €183 to €200 next year, not this year, next year. And that, my friends, is a 9% increase in capitation grant. So I don't know where they're going with their 17% increase when we're only getting 9%. But I tell you, private schools, you're in the firing line from the papers, whatever you're doing at the moment. I found another article which I kind of liked. I think it first appeared around just before Christmas, but I must have missed it, about school rules and which school rules make sense and which don't. So Jen Hogan, who's a parenting columnist, I'm finding these days that education and parenting seem to be wrapped up into the same category when it comes to the media. I mean, I was on Claire Byrne, as I said, and when I'm on the radio, I was thinking back to all the things I go on about, and 90% of them are actually not really education issues at all. Our summer holidays is not an education issue, it's really a parenting issue. I think the main reason people want to shorten the summer holidays is it suits parents rather than suiting children. However, this was an article from Jen Hogan about uniforms, piercings and haircuts. What makes sense? So I was interested. Well, we'll get onto the piercings and the haircuts first, because I find them baffling, why schools stop children and stop students from having ear piercings and different colour hair and different haircuts and all the rest of it. And I also find uniforms baffling as well. But I think what I was interested in this article was the people. They didn't ask really that many teachers. They asked a teacher who was actually speaking in her role as a parent about their opinion. Why do schools have these arbitrary rules around these things like uniforms and things like that, and piercings and haircuts? And other than snobbery is my kind of feeling on why we don't allow piercings and different hair colours and different hairstyles. It's pure snobbery. And it's outdated now. I mean, you look at adults these days. I remember when I started working, if you had a tattoo, and very few people did in my day, you had to cover it with those blue plasters. Or if you had a piercing of any on your face, you had to cover it with blue plaster. A lot of that is gone now in the workplace. Schools are no different. I don't understand it. And the idea of a uniform, as you know, if you've listened to the podcast, I just found it so outdated, so British, really, in a way, that we're still part of the Queen's Army by wearing our uniform, and we are subjects of the King or the Queen of England, which is the reason for uniforms in the first place back in the 14th century when they were first introduced. And and obviously countries like Germany and most countries in Europe, actually, in fact, almost all countries in Europe don't have a uniform. I mentioned Germany in particular because of the association with uniforms in Germany and the far right. That we see that uniforms can be seen as army-type affairs. So what are we trying to say to children? That you have to look the same. There are certain standards of what you wear and so on. And I think that's what the article goes on about. I never really got an answer to the question on that, really, about what are the reasons, because she didn't actually ask any teachers who were justifying it. It was a bit of a critique of policies and all the rest. It's, most of the people in this are then it moved on to skirts versus trousers rather than actually uniforms at all, which is a bit disappointed about, because I think we should be talking about the idea of not wearing uniforms in any way, shape or form. But I know I'm in the minority on that. What I did find funny, though, was a letter to the Irish Times followed from a gentleman called Garrod O'Rian, who actually belongs to something called Say No to School Uniforms. He's in Westport, and I think that's brilliant. I mean, I loved his letter, basically calling it out with loads of statistics about how nonsense-like it is, and with a sentence I like there: highly paid principals are wasting enormous amounts of time patrolling uniforms in military-style lineups when there are far more important issues to deal with. And I will ignore the highly paid principals. I mean, they could have just said principals, but apart from that, very good sentence to sum my feelings up on uniforms in many ways. And just when I thought I wouldn't be mentioning smartphones in my fortnightly newsletter, two teachers came along, and they've been around for a while. There they are. They came up with this idea. There's a picture here if you're watching the video. It's the phone away box. It's basically a cellophane box or some sort of, I think it's cellophane, is there a plastic box of some sort, which basically sticks onto the student's locker. And basically they put their phone in there and everyone can see that where their phone is. It seems to be a roaring success. I love the fact that two teachers came along, they saw the smartphone problem and they came up with a business, and it looks like they're moving that business out of Ireland into the UK, where the smartphone seems to be an issue as well. And I just think it's a great story. Fair play, as Ireland is a great country for innovation and entrepreneurialism, and I love the fact that we can't solve the smartphone issue in Ireland because parents seem unable or unwilling to manage their children's smartphone use. So these two lads have come up with a way of doing it, and fair play to them. Just as I've kind of given out, and I do give out about the idea that schools should be solving parental issues such as smartphones, Pasi Sahlberg was over in Ireland. And Pasi Sahlberg was the Minister for Education in Finland when Finland was the greatest education system in the world ever. He's moved to Australia. He came to Ireland to give a talk to the NAPD and IPPN, who are the principal networks, both secondary and primary level. He gave a symposium. The Irish Times just picked up on smartphone use, and he said that student well-being is sharply declining as a result of smartphone use. This comes from the PISA report, which I looked at, and I am not one to disagree with Pasi Sahlberg in many ways, but the graph that was shown around smartphone usage was dodgy at best. I mean, I think it makes absolute sense that if you spend 8 hours on a smartphone for a day, your well-being is going to be decreased immensely. But it was the lower numbers which were kind of interesting, insofar as up to an hour things were bad. They got worse for an hour to 2 hours. But if you were on for 2 to 3 hours, it was fine. But then if you went from 3 to 4 hours, it was bad again. So you're not getting a pattern. So, I mean, really the pattern should be a kind of a graph where something like that or like this in terms of well-being, that being decreased or whatever it is. I mean, essentially, look, I don't disagree with them. Particularly, smartphones do make well-being suffer. Anyone who has children who lets their child use a device and asks them to come off that device will tell you the mood that their child is in after after coming off the device, and you actually need a bit of a break to calm down. It's whatever's in that, is it dopamine, say, and all the rest of it? I'm not quite sure. But forget all that. My favourite story of the couple of weeks comes from a Fianna Fail politician. I have no idea, and maybe he does have a background in technology. I don't know who he is. I only know his name, Malcolm Byrne, from a story in Gorey with the Gael school there, and a very kind of dodgy situation that happened there, where a principal was removed from his position and it ended up seemingly wrongly, and 10 years later had to be reinstated. But Malcolm Byrne was on the board of that school, or was certainly involved in that story. But anyway, he is back advising schools about what the classroom is going to look like in only 5 or 6 years, by the end of the decade. So I wanted to read a part of that, part of it, because it's I don't know if it's humorous, but I'll read the first paragraph. In classrooms, at the end of this decade, students will wear a piece of neurotechnology that will be integrated into a headset or another device that will use brainwaves to indicate their levels of attention or understanding of the subject being taught. This can alert the teacher as to whether their class is fully engaged, or if they need to try a different way to engage or to give the students a break. This kind of dystopian stuff is amazing. I mean, it reminds me of, I spend a lot of time comparing things to things you see in The Simpsons, but I think it's any 1960s sort of TV program about what the future will look like in the year 2000, the flying cars and people kind of not speaking to each other, speaking by telepathy. No one will need to speak anymore, or everybody, living on the moon and all this kind of stuff. This idea that and that school would be, the Simpsons had one in school where you basically had a TV screen as the teacher, and there was maybe 100, they'd ask a question. Yes, Mikey in sector 4-3, you answered this question, kind of thing. I can't remember the episode of The Simpsons, something Simpsons the future anyway. But this idea of the dystopia that we'd actually be plugging children into devices that would look at their brainwaves to see if they're paying attention or not. I mean, what kind of school life would that be? I would like to hope that by 2030, that's not what's going to happen. And I mean, well, I enjoyed some of the ideas that you could use virtual reality. I think that's what he's trying to get at, that it could bring you back to, he gave the idea of 1916, and he's also talked about AI and large language models. I mean, that's a very interesting kind of idea. I don't know what that's going to look like in 2030. I just get the idea. I mean, I kind of think things are going to move on a lot more than he's even saying there. I mean, I won't go on, but you can have a look at the Irish Times. All the links to these articles are in my newsletter. But it was a really weird kind of article, and I have no idea who Malcolm Byrne is in terms of education, or what his qualifications would be in terms of predicting what kind of technology would be or would not be used in education in 2030. I mean, I wouldn't even hazard a guess. I'd like to hope that we wouldn't be plugging children into headsets that would measure their brainwaves. I would like to think that, I mean, I in the last 20 years of technology in education, there hasn't been that many, mad things that have come along. I mean, the internet was possibly the first mad thing that could have changed absolutely everything, and certainly did. The interactive whiteboard, some might argue, would have done the same. It was the first time that schools really embraced technology in education in Ireland. I do think AI will have a big impact. I'm not sure how. Certainly it should have an impact on teachers' planning or the way they deliver things. I also think it might open up ways for students to sort of interact with things they may not have been able to interact with before. You'll see, if you're on my newsletter, you'll see that this week I've made a video about interacting with a spreadsheet. So whereas before you would have to learn all these complicated formulas to find out information, which is very beyond probably a primary school student's abilities, you can actually ask a question in English to a spreadsheet and it will give you the answer to that. And that can be very interesting if you've got some good questions. I'd like to think that, that's what will change a little bit in the classroom. But one other thing, and Malcolm Byrne is actually a Fianna Fail TD, and in Fianna Fail's programme for government, They say by the end of the decade, in 2030, there will be 400 multi-denominational schools. Currently, we're in 2024, the first week or two in 2024, and we're not even close to that, and we are only opening one multi-denominational school in September 2024, as far as I know, maybe two. So at that pace, we're going to be a long way off, and I would possibly suggest that Malcolm Byrne's suggestion that we'll be plugging our brains into devices is probably more likely than the very minor ambition to have 400 multi-denominational schools. I wonder who will be more correct. So there you go. They are that's my analysis of the news. I'd really be interested in thinking, did you like this? Was this a change, from the If I Were the Minister for Education podcast where I take one issue? Did you like using the video? Did you like doing the video? Is it something that you'd like to see more of? If you were listening, was it interesting? Did I move to stories well or not? Was my analysis of the news any good? I guess this is a bit of an experiment. If you like it, let me know. If you don't like it, please let me know, because I'm one of these people that assumes if I don't hear anything that people like it. If you like it but you think I could do better, I'd love to know as well. So that's it for me for this week. If you enjoyed this, or if you'd like to see or hear any of my previous bits of work in education, primary education, you can subscribe to If I Were the Minister for Education, the podcast, on any of your favourite podcasting platforms. You can go to anshaw.net and read any of the articles that I am reading. The show notes are always available on anshaw.net, and I write about education in lots of different places. If you want to read some of those articles, you'll also find them on anshaw.net, or you can subscribe to my Feedly feed and see if you like that. So loads of places to find me. I'm becoming a little bit too easy to find as I try and escape Twitter. Speaking of which, on my newsletter, I find some posts and threads that I've also found interesting. It's a really, really good interaction between two teachers that I'll be posting up around, which I think you should probably have a look at, around the inspectorate and the need for an inspectorate. Really good interaction between two teachers on that, which I'd really recommend you have a look at. Anyway, that is it from me. Thank you so much for watching or listening, depending on what medium you're coming from, and I will chat to you soon. Thanks so much. All the best. Bye bye.